It was a bright morning in the small city where everyone seemed to know each other. The sun had just begun to rise over the hills, painting the streets with soft golden light. People were heading to work, shopkeepers were opening their stores, and children were rushing to school with their backpacks bouncing behind them. Among them was a young woman who had recently moved to town. She carried herself quietly, trying not to draw attention. Her clothes were modest, her eyes soft but alert, and she seemed to be someone who preferred peace over noise. She had come to this city only a few weeks ago. Most people didn't know much about her except that she had moved into a small apartment near the park. She often kept to herself, going out early for work and returning home before dark. The neighbors noticed her polite manners and calm voice whenever she greeted them, but no one really knew her story. What no one realized was that behind her quiet presence was someone connected to power and influence. Someone whose life wasn't as simple as it appeared. That morning, she was running late for her new job at the local community office. She had been trying hard to adjust, doing everything on her own without revealing who she truly was. She wanted to live like an ordinary person for a while, free from all the attention and judgment that usually followed her name. Her husband, the state governor, had agreed that she needed this break, a time to breathe, to live among ordinary people without being recognized or treated differently. As she walked quickly toward the bus stop, her mind was filled with thoughts about her work. She had been assigned to help organize charity programs for children from low-income families. It was the kind of work that gave her purpose, something she had always wanted to do even before her marriage. She carried a small folder under her arm, her shoes clicking softly on the pavement as she crossed the street. But that morning, fate decided to test her in an unexpected way. A police car was parked near the corner of the street, and two officers were inside talking casually. One of them was new to the area, a man known among his colleagues for being strict, sometimes too strict. He believed in following rules, but had also developed a habit of judging people too quickly based on appearances. When he saw the young woman walking briskly down the street, his attention sharpened. She didn't look like she belonged to the part of town she was in. To him, she looked nervous, her steps hurried. His suspicions, though baseless, started to grow. He stepped out of the car and called out to her, his tone more commanding than polite. She turned, startled, clutching her folder a little tighter. The officer asked where she was going, his eyes scanning her from head to toe. She explained softly that she was on her way to work, her voice trembling slightly because of his sudden approach. But instead of listening, he kept questioning her, asking for her ID, asking where she lived, asking why she was walking alone so early. His tone carried a hint of doubt, as if he believed she was hiding something. The people nearby started to slow down, watching from a distance but not interfering. In moments like these, silence often took over. People preferred to stay out of trouble. The young woman's hands shook as she reached for her bag to take out her ID. Her heart raced, not because she was guilty, but because she had never been treated like this before. She had always been surrounded by respect and protection, not suspicion. This moment was different. It felt humiliating and frightening at the same time. The officer's partner, still sitting in the car, glanced up from his coffee and frowned. Something about the scene didn't sit right with him. The young woman's voice, her trembling hands, the fear in her eyes, it didn't seem like the reaction of someone who was doing wrong. But the first officer ignored his instincts and continued questioning her harshly. He kept talking about routine checks, but his words felt more like intimidation than procedure. Finally, after checking her ID, he found nothing wrong. But instead of letting her go, he decided to make a scene about her attitude, claiming she wasn't being cooperative enough. The young woman's eyes filled with tears she tried hard to hide. She apologized again and again, saying she was only late for work. Her soft, respectful tone only seemed to irritate him more, as if her calmness challenged his authority. At that moment, a man passing by stopped to record the scene on his phone. He didn't say anything but wanted to make sure there was proof of what was happening. The officer noticed the camera but didn't stop right away. His pride had already taken control of his actions. The woman stood still, too afraid to argue or defend herself. She just wanted it to end. Finally, his partner got out of the car and stepped closer, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "That's enough," he said quietly but firmly. The first officer hesitated, his jaw tightening, but he finally backed off. The young woman whispered a thank you and quickly walked away, holding her folder close to her chest. Her steps were shaky, but she didn't look back. The people around her watched silently as she disappeared around the corner. When she reached her workplace, she went straight to the restroom and locked the door behind her. For a few minutes, she just stood there, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her eyes were red, her hands trembling. She tried to take deep breaths, to calm herself down, to remind herself that she was safe now. But the feeling of humiliation wouldn't fade. She had faced something she had only heard others talk about, being judged for how she looked, not for who she was. Later that day, as she sat at her desk trying to focus on her work, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from her husband's assistant. The message said, "Are you okay?" Something came up. Confused, she replied that she was fine, just a bit tired. The assistant didn't reply immediately. Moments later, her phone rang again. This time it was the governor himself. He sounded calm, but there was a certain edge to his voice. "Are you sure you're okay?" he asked. She hesitated for a second, then said yes. She didn't want to tell him what had happened. She didn't want to cause trouble or bring attention to herself. But deep down, she knew he already knew something. There was no way an incident involving a police officer and the governor's wife would stay quiet for long, especially when someone had recorded it. That evening, as she sat quietly in her apartment, the reality of the morning began to sink in. She thought about how quickly things had spiraled out of control. One moment she was just walking to work. The next she was being treated like she didn't belong. She wondered how many others face such moments every day without anyone noticing. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how deeply unfair the world could be. Even for someone like her, someone with power behind her name but invisible when she chose to live like everyone else. Across town, the officer sat in his car, unaware of the storm that was about to unfold. His partner had already reported the incident to the supervisor, mentioning how things had gone too far. The video taken by the passerby was already spreading on social media, slowly gaining attention. People were starting to talk, asking questions. No one knew yet that the woman in the video was not just any ordinary citizen, but the governor's spouse. The city was about to wake up to a story that would shake its foundations. The young woman didn't know what awaited her the next morning. The reactions, the questions, the apologies that would come too late. All she wanted was a simple life away from politics and power. But fate had other plans. The incident that began with fear and silence was about to become something much larger. A turning point that would test not only her strength, but also the conscience of everyone involved. The next morning, the city woke up to something different. What had been a quiet, ordinary place suddenly turned into a center of whispers and questions. A video had started spreading on social media during the night. It showed a young woman being stopped and questioned harshly by a police officer on a street corner. At first, it looked like just another clip of unfair treatment, something that usually caused outrage for a day or two before disappearing. But this time, there was something unusual about it. People couldn't stop talking about how composed the woman looked, how scared she seemed, and yet how polite she remained throughout the incident. By the time the governor's office opened that morning, the video had already been shared thousands of times. Some people were calling for justice, while others were asking who the woman was. The governor himself hadn't said a word publicly. He had spent most of the night watching the same clip over and over again, his face tight with disbelief. He couldn't recognize her at first because she looked different, wearing plain clothes, with her hair tied back, and no security around her. But as the camera turned slightly and he saw her eyes, he froze. He didn't need anyone to tell him who she was. He knew instantly that it was his wife. He sat in silence for a long time. The pain on her face in that short video said more than words ever could. It wasn't only the humiliation that broke him. It was the fear he saw in her, the fear of someone who didn't want trouble, who didn't want to reveal her identity, and who had been treated unfairly for no reason. He wanted to storm into the police department immediately, but he stopped himself. He knew she had gone to live quietly for a reason. She had wanted to understand how people lived when no one recognized their last name, to see the world through ordinary eyes. And now she had seen a part of it that was cruel and real. Meanwhile, at her small apartment, she hadn't checked her phone. She didn't know the video had gone viral. She was trying to prepare for work, convincing herself to move on from what happened the previous day. She didn't want to think about it anymore. She told herself it was just one bad experience, that not everyone was like that officer. She wanted to go back to her normal routine and act like nothing had changed. When she arrived at work, however, things didn't feel the same. People were whispering softly as she passed by. A few coworkers looked at her with curiosity, while others avoided eye contact. She tried to ignore it, assuming maybe she had done something wrong at work without realizing it. But when her supervisor called her into the office, her heart began to beat faster. He asked her to sit down and looked at her for a long moment before speaking. His tone was kind but careful. "There's something I need to tell you," he said. He hesitated before continuing. "Someone recorded what happened yesterday morning. It's all over the internet." Her breath caught. She felt her hands grow cold. "What?" she whispered. He nodded, sliding his phone toward her. "You should see this before it spreads further." Her eyes widened as she watched the short clip. It was her, standing on the sidewalk, clutching her folder, being questioned by the officer. The camera was shaky, but the sound was clear enough to hear the officer's harsh tone and her soft voice replying politely. She could barely watch herself on the screen. Every second made her heart ache. She remembered how small she had felt in that moment, how powerless. Her supervisor tried to comfort her. "People are angry about it. They're supporting you. They're saying the officer went too far." But she didn't feel comforted. All she could think about was what would happen when people realized who she really was. Her quiet life, her peaceful days, everything was about to end. Not long after, her phone started buzzing nonstop. Dozens of missed calls and messages appeared. Her husband's name flashed on the screen, but she couldn't bring herself to answer. She knew what he would say. He would be furious, not at her, but at the people who had hurt her. And once he got involved, there would be no turning back. She left the office quietly, walking down the street without any clear direction. She just needed space to think. As she walked, people on the street began to recognize her from the video. A few gave her sympathetic looks. Some even approached her to say they supported her. She smiled weakly, thanking them, but inside, she felt exposed. The anonymity she had treasured was gone. At the police station, the atmosphere was tense. The video had reached the chief's desk early that morning, and everyone knew there would be consequences. The officer who had confronted her sat in silence, his hands clasped tightly on the table. His partner stood near the door, watching him with disappointment. The chief walked in holding a printed copy of the report. "Do you know who that woman is?" he asked sharply. The officer shook his head, trying to sound confident. "Just some woman walking around suspiciously." The chief's eyes narrowed. "That some woman is the governor's wife." The words hit him like a stone. He stared in disbelief. His throat went dry, his face pale. He tried to speak, but couldn't find the right words. The room went silent except for the faint hum of the ceiling fan. "She wasn't doing anything wrong," the chief continued. "You embarrassed this department. The video is everywhere. Do you realize what you've done?" The officer muttered an apology, but it sounded weak even to his own ears. His partner looked away, shaking his head. The chief sighed heavily. "I don't care who she was. What matters is how you treated her. You judged her without reason. That's not how this badge works." The officer sat in shame, unable to respond. He had let his pride guide his actions, and now the entire city was watching. By evening, the story had reached national news. Reporters stood outside the governor's office waiting for a statement. The governor finally appeared in front of the cameras, his face calm but serious. He didn't shout or show anger. Instead, his words were measured, thoughtful, and powerful. "My wife chose to live quietly for a while," he said. "She wanted to understand the lives of ordinary people. She didn't ask for special treatment. She wanted respect, the same respect every citizen deserves. What happened to her shouldn't happen to anyone, regardless of who they are." The reporters listened in silence. His words carried weight, not because of his title, but because of the pain behind them. He ended his statement with a message to the public. "This isn't just about my family. This is about how we treat one another when we think no one is watching. At her apartment, she watched the broadcast quietly, her eyes filled with tears, not from anger but from sadness and pride. She hadn't wanted the world to find out, but now that it had, she hoped something good might come of it. Maybe people would start to see things differently. Maybe someone else wouldn't have to feel the fear she had felt that morning. Meanwhile, the officer sat alone in his small apartment, replaying everything in his mind. He thought about the look on her face, the trembling in her hands, the way she had kept her composure despite his harsh words. For the first time, he began to truly see what he had done, not just to her but to himself. He realized how easily power could turn into arrogance, how quickly a moment of pride could destroy years of trust. He picked up his phone and typed a message to his supervisor, asking for a meeting. He knew he couldn't undo what had happened, but he wanted to take responsibility. He wanted to apologize, not because she was the governor's wife, but because she was a person who had deserved kindness and respect. As night fell, the city was still buzzing with conversations about the video, the governor's speech, and the identity of the woman at the center of it all. But in her small apartment, she sat by the window watching the lights flicker across the street. Despite everything, she felt a strange calm inside her. Maybe the truth had a way of finding its voice, even when you tried to hide it. She closed her eyes and whispered a quiet prayer, not for herself but for understanding, for change, and for everyone who had ever been made to feel small. Because deep down, she knew this story was no longer just hers. It had become a mirror for everyone to look into, a reminder that sometimes, even in the darkest moments, something good can begin to grow. The next morning brought silence to the city. The streets looked the same, but something in the air felt heavy. Everyone had seen the video by now. Everyone had heard the governor's calm but firm words, and everyone had an opinion about what had happened. Some people were still angry at the police. Some felt sorry for the young woman who had been treated unfairly, and some simply watched in silence, unsure what to think. Inside her small apartment, the governor's wife sat quietly at the table with a cup of tea in her hands. The night had been long. She hadn't slept much, not because she was afraid, but because her mind kept replaying everything. The faces, the voices, the questions, it all came back again and again. She wasn't angry anymore. She was just tired. She didn't like being the center of attention. She never wanted this to become a story. All she wanted was to live like a normal person for a while, to help others quietly, without the noise of politics. Her phone had been ringing non-stop since morning. Calls from news stations, messages from friends, even strangers sending her words of support. She read a few, but then she turned the phone face down. She didn't want to read more. Her heart still ached from the way the officer had looked at her, the way he had spoken to her like she didn't belong. But what hurt even more was knowing how many people lived through moments like that every day, without anyone to stand up for them. She stood up slowly and looked out the window. The same park she used to walk through now had reporters standing near it, hoping to catch a glimpse of her. She sighed softly. It was over now. The peace she had once found here. She knew she would have to leave soon, go back to the mansion, return to her public life. But part of her didn't want to. She had seen something real in this place. She had met people who struggled but still smiled, people who worked hard and asked for nothing. As she stood there lost in thought, there was a soft knock at the door. She hesitated before opening it. When she did, she found a familiar face. It was the officer's partner. He looked uncomfortable, his eyes showing guilt. He removed his cap and said quietly, "Ma'am, may I come in for a moment?" She nodded slowly and stepped aside. He walked in, looking around the small, simple room. It was nothing like the kind of place a governor's wife would be expected to live in, and that surprised him. She asked if he wanted some tea, but he shook his head. "I came here because I needed to say something," he began. "I was there that morning. I should have done more. I should have stopped him sooner." His voice trembled slightly, and she could see he was sincere. She sat down and gestured for him to do the same. "You did try," she said softly. "You told him to stop." "That was enough." He shook his head. "No, it wasn't. I should have spoken louder. I didn't want trouble with my department, and I stayed quiet longer than I should have. I'm sorry, truly." She smiled faintly, though her eyes were sad. "Sometimes silence speaks louder than words," she said. "But thank you for coming here. It means more than you think. He nodded, relief mixed with shame. He's been suspended, he said after a pause. The department's investigating the case. But I wanted you to know he's not a bad man. He just let his pride take over. I'm not defending what he did, I think he's learning a hard lesson now. She looked down at her cup of tea. We all make mistakes, she said quietly. What matters is what we do after. The officer looked at her for a long moment, then stood up to leave. Before he reached the door, she spoke again. Tell him I forgive him, she said softly. But I hope he never forgets what this felt like, for either of us. He nodded silently and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Later that afternoon, the governor called her again. This time she answered. His voice was gentle but filled with worry. They're offering to arrange a press conference, he said. You don't have to speak if you don't want to. I can handle it, she paused for a moment. No, she said softly. I think I should. Not to defend myself, but to speak for others. If my face is out there now, maybe it should mean something. He didn't argue. He knew her well enough to understand that once she made up her mind, she wouldn't change it. That evening, she stood before a small group of reporters. The lights were bright and the cameras clicked nonstop, but she stayed calm. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was soft but clear. I didn't want my identity to matter, she began. When I moved to this city, I just wanted to live quietly like everyone else. I wanted to see the world without guards or cameras. I never imagined something like this would happen. But it did. And now maybe we can talk about what it means. She paused for a moment, looking at the faces in front of her. Some reporters were surprised by her calm tone. They had expected anger or tears, but she gave neither. What happened to me happens to people every day, she continued. People are judged for how they look, where they come from, or what they wear. They're treated unfairly, spoken to harshly, or made to feel small. I had the privilege of being recognized afterward, but many others don't. They go home unseen, unheard. That's what hurts the most. Her words touched everyone in the room. There was no shouting, no grand speech, just honesty. And sometimes honesty speaks louder than anything else. After the conference, the governor met her backstage. He looked at her with a mixture of pride and sadness. You always find a way to turn pain into strength, he said quietly. She smiled faintly. I didn't do it for myself, she said. I did it because I saw fear in people's eyes yesterday, the same fear I felt. If something good can come from this, then maybe it was meant to happen. As the night went on, the story continued to spread. But this time it wasn't just about the video. It was about her speech, her forgiveness, and her quiet courage. People from different cities began sharing their own stories of unfair treatment, of being judged without reason. The video that once showed pain now started a conversation about respect and understanding. Meanwhile, the officer who had caused it all sat in his small apartment, watching her speech on TV. He listened to every word, his eyes wet with regret. He had spent the past few days in silence, replaying his mistakes in his mind. Hearing her forgive him so openly broke something inside him. He realized that what he had done wasn't just a mistake. It was a mirror showing him who he had become. And he didn't like that man. The next morning, he decided to visit the community center where she worked. He didn't know if she would be there, but he wanted to apologize face to face. When he arrived, she was speaking with a few volunteers. She noticed him immediately but didn't seem angry. He walked over slowly, his head slightly bowed. I came to say I'm sorry, he said softly. Not because of who you are, but because of who I wasn't that day. There was a long silence. She looked at him, then simply nodded. I hope you learn from it, she said gently. That's all anyone can do. He nodded back, his voice almost a whisper. I will. As he walked away, she felt a small sense of peace. Forgiveness didn't erase what had happened, but it gave both of them a chance to move forward. Over the next few weeks, the city slowly returned to normal. The reporters left, the news moved on, and people went back to their daily lives. But something had changed. In police meetings, officers began discussing empathy and respect. Community programs started focusing more on fairness. The video that once caused outrage had somehow sparked a quiet change in hearts. At her apartment, she packed her bags slowly. It was time to return home to her husband, to her old life. But as she looked around one last time, she smiled softly. This place had taught her something no title or privilege ever could. It had shown her the truth of the world, the good, the bad, and the hope that could grow in between. Before leaving, she wrote a short note and left it on the kitchen table. It said, "Thank you, City, for teaching me what it means to be seen." She locked the door, took one last look at the quiet street and walked away, not as a governor's wife, but as a woman who had seen the world up close, and who had helped it see itself a little clearer too. When she returned home to the governor's residence, the world outside had already moved on to the next headline, but the people closest to her hadn't. The guards at the gate stood straighter as she walked past them, and the house staff greeted her with nervous smiles, unsure whether to treat her like the same calm woman who used to thank them personally, or like someone who had just shaken an entire city. She smiled back warmly, trying to ease the tension, but inside she felt something different. The silence of the house, the soft echo of her footsteps, it all reminded her how different this place was from the small apartment she had just left. Her husband was waiting for her in his office. The look on his face said everything. He wasn't angry, just worried. When she entered, he stood up and reached for her hand. "You shouldn't have had to go through all that," he said softly. She shook her head. "Don't blame anyone," she whispered. "It happened for a reason." He looked at her with concern. "You always say that, but sometimes I wish the world didn't have to hurt before it learned." They sat together for a long time without speaking. The warmth between them didn't need words. After a while, she said quietly, "I learned more in those few weeks than I ever did in all my years surrounded by comfort." He nodded, knowing she meant it. The next few days were busy. Reporters still called, asking for follow-up interviews, but she politely declined. She didn't want more attention. What she wanted now was change, real, lasting change. So she began to plan something quietly. She met with local leaders, teachers, and community members. Her idea was simple: to create a small program that would bring police officers and ordinary citizens together for open conversations. Not as authority and civilians, but as people who shared the same city. She believed that sometimes understanding came not from rules or speeches, but from sitting face to face and listening. When she first presented the idea to her husband, he listened carefully. "It's brave," he said, "but do you think they'll be willing to sit together?" She smiled faintly. "They will if someone starts the conversation." A week later, the first meeting was arranged in a public hall. The air was heavy with curiosity and doubt. Some police officers came because they were told to, others because they genuinely wanted to. Ordinary citizens filled the rest of the seats, unsure what to expect. At the front stood the same woman they had seen in that viral video, but she wasn't there to talk about herself. She spoke slowly, gently, in her calm tone. "We've all seen what happens when people stop seeing each other as human," she said. "When we start judging instead of understanding. That morning on the street was painful for me, yes, but it opened my eyes too. The officer saw me as someone suspicious, but I also realized he might have been carrying his own fears, his own misunderstandings. None of us are perfect, but we can start to see better." Her words didn't blame anyone. They reached hearts instead of walls. One by one, people began to speak. A young man stood up and shared how he had once been stopped for no reason, and how it made him feel small. A policewoman shared how afraid she sometimes felt walking into situations where she didn't know what to expect. The hall grew quiet as both sides began to realize they had more in common than they thought. At the end of the meeting, there was no shouting, no anger, just understanding. The governor's wife stood quietly, watching the crowd leave. Some officers even stayed behind to shake hands with the citizens they once saw only from behind badges. For the first time in a long while, she felt hope. The program continued week after week. It spread slowly to nearby towns. People started calling it the bridge meetings. Journalists who came expecting drama instead found warmth, tears, and honest stories. And although not everyone agreed, most people admitted that it felt like something real was finally happening. But change didn't come easily. There were critics, of course. Some said it was all for publicity. Others claimed it wouldn't last. She didn't let those voices stop her. She knew that no change worth making ever came without resistance. One morning, she received a letter at her office. The handwriting was careful but shaky. It was from the officer who had stopped her that day. She took a deep breath before opening it. The letter was long and sincere. He wrote, "I still remember your face that morning, and I remember the silence after I realized what I had done. I've spent every day since trying to understand why I acted that way. I've spoken to my family, to other officers, and I've attended every bridge meeting I could. You said that what matters is what we do after our mistakes. I hope I'm doing enough to show I learned. I don't expect forgiveness again, but I wanted you to know that I now see people differently. She folded the letter slowly, tears in her eyes. She had forgiven him long ago, but knowing that he had changed brought her a deeper peace. She decided not to reply publicly. Instead, she kept the letter in her drawer as a reminder that even small moments could start big transformations. As months passed, the bridge meetings turned into a movement. Schools began inviting her to speak. Young students asked her how to stay kind when the world seemed unfair. She told them, kindness isn't weakness, it's courage. The world changes when someone dares to stay kind even when it's hard. Her husband watched her from afar during one of her talks, his heart filled with pride. She wasn't just his wife anymore. She was a voice of quiet power, someone who used grace to build something stronger than anger. One evening, as the sun set over the city, she took a drive to the small apartment where everything had started. It was empty now, but the smell of old wood and the sight of the narrow window made her smile. She walked inside and ran her fingers over the simple furniture she had once used. This was where she had felt most human, where she had cried and where she had found herself again. She stepped out to the park nearby. A group of children were playing, their laughter filling the air. Parents sat on benches, chatting softly. She sat quietly under a tree, thinking about how much had changed. She had once been afraid of being seen, but now she understood that sometimes being seen was the only way to make others look deeper. A woman sitting beside her turned and smiled. "You're her, aren't you? The lady from that story?" She smiled back. "Maybe," she said softly. The woman hesitated. "I just wanted to say thank you. My son joined the police after your meeting started. He says it changed the way he sees people." The governor's wife nodded gently. "Then it was worth it," she said. They sat in silence for a while, watching the children play until the sun dipped behind the trees. That night, as she returned home, she found her husband waiting with a small surprise. In the center of the garden stood a new tree freshly planted. A wooden sign beside it read, "The Bridge Tree, for every heart that learned to see." She touched the leaves gently, feeling their softness. It reminded her of the day everything had begun, the fear, the humiliation, and the silence. But now, standing under the open sky, she felt none of that. What had once been pain had become something living, growing, and full of hope. Her husband wrapped an arm around her shoulder. "You turned something cruel into something beautiful," he said quietly. She looked at the tree again and smiled. "I didn't do it alone," she said. "The world helped me. It just needed a reason." And as the evening wind moved through the branches, the tree swayed softly, just like her heart, no longer burdened but free, standing tall against the same sky where her story had begun. The following months brought a quiet rhythm to her days, but it wasn't the same kind of peace she once knew. It was a different calm, one that came from finding purpose. Every morning she woke up before sunrise, made her tea, and sat by the window overlooking the garden. The bridge tree had grown taller, its leaves brighter, as if the earth itself understood the meaning behind it. Watching it gave her comfort. It reminded her that healing wasn't about forgetting, it was about growing. Her husband often joined her at the table, still in his robe, with files and letters in hand. "You've become busier than me," he teased one morning. She smiled, stirring her tea. "You handle the state," she said. "I handle the hearts." What began as a few meetings had turned into something much bigger. The bridge movement had reached different cities, and now even schools, hospitals, and small organizations were creating their own bridge circles. People would gather to share their stories, listen to each other, and learn how to see the person behind every uniform, every label, every rumor. She was invited to speak at many of these gatherings, though she always insisted on keeping things simple. No podiums, no grand introductions, just a chair in a circle like everyone else. She wanted people to know she was no different from them. One evening, she attended a bridge circle in a small coastal town. The room was warm and full of people, fishermen, shopkeepers, police officers, and a few teenagers. The air smelled of salt and hope. When she walked in, they stood up respectfully, but she motioned for them to sit. "We're all equal here," she said softly. An older man spoke first. His hands were rough from years of work at sea. I didn't trust the police, he admitted. Not after they closed our docks for weeks and never explained why. I thought they only cared about rules, not lives. A young officer sitting across from him looked nervous but spoke up. I was one of the ones sent here, he said quietly. We didn't understand your anger back then. We thought people were being difficult. I see now that we should have listened. The room fell silent. Then the old fisherman nodded, tears in his eyes. Maybe this is what we needed all along, just to talk. The woman smiled, watching them. Sometimes the biggest change begins with the smallest word, she said. By the end of the night, people were hugging, shaking hands, and even laughing together. She walked outside afterward, the cool ocean breeze brushing against her face. The sound of waves reminded her how everything in life moves in cycles: anger, forgiveness, love, and understanding. Nothing stays still. Back in the capital, her husband's office was full of discussions about the growing movement. Advisors debated whether to make it a formal program under the government's name. But she wasn't sure she wanted that. It should belong to the people, she said during one meeting. If the government owns it, it will become a rule. If people own it, it will stay a feeling. Her husband nodded. He understood her point. Sometimes the most powerful changes didn't need official titles or speeches. They needed genuine hearts. Despite the good work, not everyone supported her. Some people mocked her in online posts, saying she was pretending to care, or that she only did this because of her position. Others said she was wasting time on emotions when the world needed stricter laws. She read some of those comments late one night and felt a pang of sadness. She went out to the garden and stood beneath the bridge tree. The moonlight shone through the leaves, making patterns on the ground. Her husband found her there a few minutes later. Reading the news again? He asked gently. She nodded. They don't know what we're trying to do. He took her hand. You're planting something that takes time to grow. People only see the soil now. They don't see the roots forming. She leaned her head against his shoulder and whispered, I just hope the roots are strong enough. Over time, she started training volunteers who wanted to lead their own bridge circles. Some were teachers, some police officers, and some were just ordinary people tired of living with fear and anger. She taught them how to listen without judging, how to ask gentle questions, and how to end each meeting with kindness. At one session, a young woman came up to her after everyone left. I used to think talking doesn't help, she said softly. But now, after hearing others, I realize silence hurts more. That night, as the governor's wife sat at her desk, she thought about those words. Silence had hurt her too once. The silence on that day when she was stopped and no one spoke up for her. The silence in her heart when she didn't know if she could forgive. But now she understood. Every time someone spoke honestly, it broke another piece of that silence. Months turned into a year. The bridge tree stood tall, its branches now spreading wide enough to shade the garden bench. People who visited the governor's house often stopped to look at it. Some even touched the trunk and whispered a prayer. It had become a symbol of unity, something beautiful born from pain. One afternoon, she was invited to a large university event. The students there had created a bridge club, and they wanted her to see their work. She arrived quietly, without the usual escort, wearing simple clothes. The students welcomed her with flowers, and one of them led her to a wall covered in handwritten notes. Each note began with the words, I once judged someone because... She read them one by one. I once judged someone because they looked angry, but later I found out they were grieving. I once judged a teacher for being strict, but she was trying to protect us. I once judged a police officer until I heard his story. Her eyes filled with tears. She turned to the students and said softly, You have no idea how powerful these words are. You're rewriting the story of this country, one heart at a time. When she returned home that night, she placed one of the notes in her journal. She had started keeping a small book, a personal record of stories, lessons, and letters she had received from people touched by the movement. Some were from strangers. Some were from people who had once disliked her. Every story reminded her that change didn't happen in speeches. It happened in moments. Later that month, a letter arrived from abroad. It was from a woman who had seen her story online and started similar meetings in her own city. We call it the Bridge Circle, the letter said. We talk, we listen, and we forgive. I don't know you, but I feel like I do. She folded the letter carefully and smiled. The idea that something born from her small pain had reached other parts of the world felt unreal. but it also made her realize that kindness traveled faster than she ever could. That evening, she sat in the garden again, watching the fireflies glow between the branches. The air was warm and the smell of flowers filled the space. Her husband joined her with 2 cups of tea. "You've done more than anyone expected," he said quietly. She looked at the tree. "I didn't do it for praise," she said. "I did it because I couldn't stand seeing people afraid of each other." He nodded. "And because you saw what others didn't," she smiled faintly. "Maybe I just saw what we'd forgotten, that we're all the same when we stop pretending to be different." The night grew darker, but her heart felt light. She knew there was still a long way to go, many minds to change, many hearts to reach. But she also knew something else, that change once started never really stops. It keeps moving quietly, like the wind through leaves, like the waves against the shore. And as she closed her eyes under the bridge tree, she made a silent promise to keep building bridges no matter how many walls the world tried to raise. Because sometimes the simplest act of listening could heal what years of anger could not.